92.7 QLZ hanging out I guess you could call it backstage, the loading dock of the St. Louis WizardCon with Jason Mewes. Brother, we're walking through here kind of hanging out as we're getting to this area. You look like a kid at a candy store at these Comic-Cons.
Yeah, it's exciting. We've been coming to, we've been at one almost every week the past 2 months too, and I feel like each one is still just as exciting because, each place has their own setup. I mean, you'll see a lot of the same vendors and such, but there's always new vendors and new setups. Like, they have the Dumb and Dumber van that's like a dog or whatever the heck, and they have the the Fast and the Furious car, and it just little stuff like that's different than the other one. But what I find interesting about this one too is like there's how much people are into the cons now. It's like now you're seeing booths. Like there's a dude here that's set up. He has a leaf filter for gutters, which isn't comic book related at all. So it's interesting. So yes, my point is yes, each comic book convention is different and just as exciting for me to look around and it gets me butterflies in my tummy.
How do you feel about the growth of it? Because like you said, it's different things. I mean, it's gone from comic books to now all forms of media.
Yes, I mean, now it's, I mean, I've been going since, I think, 90, well, even before that. I mean, we used to, in Jersey, I started reading comics at 13, 14, and I remember going up at, like, 16, going up to New York to these little comic book conventions in the basements of churches in New York, and those were conventions to me at the time. And then I got to go to San Diego and Chicago Wizard World and all this stuff, and again they started off to me, it was like all these vendors with lots of comic books and boxes of comics and the back issues and all that and new issues, what have you, lots of statues and toys, and just like each year it grows and grows, and there's movie promotion like setups and like I said, gutters with leaf covers and RC helicopters, and I mean there's a costume place here, a horror party convention. I don't know. It's where they have like a creature screaming and a coffin with a skeleton that pops up. So yes, it just keeps growing and growing, and different people and situations are happening, so it's interesting.
You're talking about movies. Can you talk a little bit about Mallbrats or Clerks 3 yet, or are you still kind of not allowed to say too much on it yet?
I don't know how much I'm allowed to say. Definitely, right now, Clerks 3, all I could say is it's sort of been pushed aside because there's, I believe, a scheduling or some kind of scheduling conflict or something. And instead of waiting to figure that out, we pushed and we're moving over to Mallbrats, which will hopefully be start shooting in October when Jason Lee is free. And I read the script last week, and it's awesome, and I'm really excited about it. I mean, Jay and Bob are going to be in it, and what our characters do in the movie is just going to be awesome, and just the movie in general, and everybody that hopefully will come back and be part of it, and I really feel like it's again, Mallrats is my favorite movie of Kevin's movies, and it was the most fun I had on a movie that I've ever made, because it was technically the first one, because Clerks is the first movie, but it was just like 10 of us, bunch of friends, made a movie, went to film festivals. I went back to work, didn't think anything of it. Mallrats was the first studio movie where they flew me out and they put me in a hotel, and we were like working with Stan Lee and Shannon Doherty and all that. It was like the real deal. So I'll never forget that, and it's still surreal to me to this day. That I got to be part of that and continue to be able to do that job, because again, I was roofing and moving furniture for a living, and I didn't plan on acting, and we got to shoot Mallrats, and it was a blast. And so I feel like that nostalgia and the fun of Mallrats when I was reading it just made me like smile and be like, oh, it'll be so much fun to shoot, let alone the script and the movie itself. I believe is awesome. I just am thinking ahead of when we start shooting how much fun it'll be. So,
and you guys are shooting in Philly?
Right now that seems like the plan. So
Now, to wrap up, you have the Jay and Silent Bob Get Old podcast, and I've heard a couple interviews where you said it's kind of like in some ways, like an intervention for you. Has anyone kind of come up to you and said, listening to you talk about everything you've been through on that podcast and even all that, you have had people say this is helping me too?
Definitely. Actually, last week or the week before at one of these conventions, it was awesome. A woman came up and said that her son, she had been listening to the podcast, and her son was struggling with drugs and stuff, and she passed it on to him, and he was a fan of the movies, of Kevin and the movies and such, and she got him listening to it, and she said now he's got like 8 months sober, and that he listens to the podcast, and it inspired him, and all that. So yes, there's been I guess we've been doing it almost 4 years, and there's definitely been at least 2 or 3, maybe more people have come up and said that they've have either they're sober or their cousin or their brother has been sober because they turned them on to the podcast, and it inspired them and my story and all that stuff, and one woman was even crying. This woman started crying and all this, and it's just amazing because I didn't plan on that when we started the podcast. It was sort of like, hey, put it out there, be accountable to all these people and me, Kevin, this being Kevin, talk about everything, and then this way you're accountable, and it has worked. I'll be in Starbucks, someone like, how many days you have sober? So it's been really cool for that reason. It's like, for me, I get to talk about stuff and never forget where I've been and tell them the horrible stories, even though when we tell them, I try to make, I can laugh at them now, but they're pretty ridiculous, and it was a bad place I was in. So talking about them reminds me I'm accountable to the people who listen, which is a big help for me. And then yes, like I said, I've heard a few people, and then even the last convention and this convention, someone has come up and said they're drug and alcohol counselors at some facilities, and they actually use the podcast as sort of a teaching tool, like, hey, look, like, and so that to me is awesome. Like, people are using it in their jobs, and people are listening, and it's even if it keeps one person sober, me being able to tell my story, that's like it's awesome for me, and again, it helps me, but it's also awesome knowing that someone else is able to stay sober. So
fantastic, man. Well, thank you for the time, brother. Much appreciated.